Chances are, if you've been coming to Blackfriars for a few years, you will at some point have been asked to be a foot, that is, to be one of the people who has their feet washed during the service we are about to perform. It is the least popular of all of the liturgical roles on the rota, so if it hasn't happened yet, the time is coming, and have your excuse ready. It is a moment, I think, when we feel unusually exposed and vulnerable, when we have our feet washed by a stranger. It's an unusually intimate gesture. And so most of us are with Simon Peter. We'd rather do the washing than be the washed. We'd rather be the one who does the washing of somebody else's foot, because that is in some strange way, although as a servant, to be in a position of power. And in a way, Peter is exactly right. What is taking place is an act of unusual intimacy. It is an exposing and vulnerable moment. Jesus is, if you like, the exposure of God. He is the eternal and infinite God who makes himself vulnerable in Christ so as to minister to us in our vulnerability. And it is only by opening ourselves up in those ways which make us feel most exposed, most vulnerable, most liable to rejection, that we find ourselves touched by the love of God given in the vulnerable Christ. Tonight we celebrate the extension of God's vulnerable self-giving in Christ into a new vulnerable form of presence which endures down the ages. Jesus institutes the Eucharist so that he might dwell with his people until the end of time. Knowing what is about to happen to him, Jesus makes himself present to us in another fragile and yet powerful way, by making himself present, truly, really, fully present, under the appearances of bread and wine. And we ought to feel, I think, something of the exposure and vulnerability and almost irreverent intimacy that we feel when we have our feet washed by somebody we don't know, when we receive the Holy Eucharist. For when we receive the Eucharist, we receive the gift of God in a form of intimacy which transcends all of our imagining and all of our expectation. The God who gives himself to us in the Eucharist, in that breakable, frangible substance, is the real God of eternal glory who presides over creation and redemption. What we see in the washing of the feet and the institution of the Eucharist are not two empty gestures where Christ signals something beyond himself. What we see in these two fundamental gestures of Holy Thursday is an expression not just of what God does, but of who God is, of who Christ is for each one of us. And we see two elements of this self-revelation of God's love in the readings which have been given for us. In the first reading, we have the prefiguration of the Passover meal. We have the people of Israel celebrating the meal which prefigures the meal of the Eucharist instituted by Christ in the blood of his new covenant. But in the two readings from the New Testament, we see different aspects of the fulfillment of that prefiguration. In the reading from St. Paul, we see, as it were, the external fulfillment of that prefigurement in the institution of a new ritual meal by which Christ makes himself fully and substantially present in our midst. But in the Gospel, we see an equally important, though easily hidden, element of God's saving love. This is not the external oblation of Christ, given once and for all on the cross and called to mind sacramentally and made present in the sacrifice of the Mass. This is now the internal oblation of Christ, his utter consecration to the will of the Father, his self-giving love in which he loves each one of us with a love simultaneously human and divine. It is that outpouring of divine generosity which we witness to in the washing of the feet. And what we will see in the days and hours that follow tonight's celebration is the attempt of human sin to pull apart that internal self-offering and the external visible reality of Christ's death on the cross. We will see the powers of sin and death try to eliminate all that is hidden and reduce Christ simply to an ignominious death, a man disempowered, depotentiated, lost and forsaken on the outskirts of the city. And what we will celebrate on the day of the resurrection night is the triumph of that internal oblation over all attempts at fragmentation and suppression. We will witness the power of God's love to safeguard and make us whole. We will witness the power of God's love triumphing over the forces of sin and death. And as we witness the attempt of Good Friday to pull apart the internal and the external, we will be consoled by the pledge of the Eucharist given to us tonight. Jesus pledging to remain with us through everything in the power of a presence which resists all fragmentation and all annihilation. The presence of Christ in the Eucharist is a presence which cannot be disrupted by any breaking of the accidents of bread and wine. Though the host may be fractured, Christ is fully, substantially present in even the smallest and most minuscule portion of the host. We cannot reduce or eliminate Christ's presence by our own force of power or sin. We can merely accept in our vulnerability to receive and be received by the power of the one who has come to make our world whole and to resist the forces of sin and fragmentation. And so tonight, whether we have our feet washed or not, the Lord comes to dwell with us and to touch our places of vulnerability, the places which we are most ashamed of. The sinful recesses of our soul are to be made alive by the power of God. For Christ, as he goes on his way, on his sorrowful journey, is gathering the fractured pieces of our lives into one and offering them to the Father to be glorified with him in his death and in his resurrection. For when we too come to share by the power of grace and glory that moment of rising, our lives will be made whole and we will no longer be liable to disruption or fragmentation.